In this video, I want to give some backstory about Mom's fire starting process in the kitchen stove that Mom did every morning. There was a lot of work went into being able to reach the point where she stood at the stove and performed the final acts of that scenario. Of course, involved were wood and coal as a fuel. The coal was purchased annually in the fall, 5 tons of it, and the price delivered to the front highway there in front of the house and dumped from a 5-ton truck was $5. It was $1 a ton. And of course, that 5-ton pile then had to be moved from along the road there in front of the house to the woodshed by wheelbarrow. So a 5-ton pile of coal makes a lot of wheelbarrowfuls of coal, but it had to be done, and before it got rained and too much weathering, because it'd be too damp then for Mom to easily start the fire in the morning. So when that coal was delivered, it was always a rush to get that stuff moved to the coal shed. And that meant wheeling around the house and down the hill into the coal shed below the house. Fortunately, the wheelbarrow was empty on the way back up the hill, but still, it was quite a job and took several days to do. A wheelbarrow full of coal didn't make a large dent in that pile, but eventually that was accomplished. Dad did part of it, and I did part of it. And well, I did what I could when I was younger, but as I grew older, the whole burden fell on me. But anyway, the coal had to be stored in a protected area, which was a coal and woodshed, and then it had to be carried in the coal buckets from the woodshed up the 22 steps to the kitchen level and placed inside the house there next to the stove. As I grew older, I carried 2 buckets at a time, but when I was younger, I'd carry a half a bucket at a time and make several trips. But in any case, there was a lot of work to get the coal at the station there by the stove. The wood had to come from the forest, and we always just used trees that were down already and lost to any cultivation or use. Dad and I would go out in the woods with our crosscut saw and axe, and with the old baby Grand Chevy pulling what was called a stone boat. It was a wooden running sled, a heavy sled behind the car, and I'll describe this car later, but it was an open touring car, a 1921 model, a baby Grand Chevy, and it had a very low geared ratio, so it didn't have any trouble pulling the sled, and even after it was full. So we'd go out to this part of the woods where Dad had noticed some trees that had fallen and were down, and we'd take this crosscut saw and cut the appropriate lengths, probably 18 inches or so, and stack it on the stone boat, and then we'd fill up the inside of the back seat of the car with pieces of wood. So we had a pretty good load each time we went. I remember one time we pulled up to this tree, and we drove through the woods and wove around the trees and so forth. The trees weren't that dense for the most part, but in any case, we pulled up near this downed tree, and we cut it up, and after a couple of hours work, we had cars stacked full of wood and a stone bulk. So Dad got in and went through the process of starting the old car, which usually started all right, and he jumped in the seat and put it in gear, but all the wheels did were spin, and we couldn't move. And after some examination, we realized that he'd pulled over a rotten stump that wasn't very visible under the leaf covering that it had. And as we loaded the old car with the cargo, the wheels sank into the ground and settled the differential on top of that old stump, so we didn't have any traction when we tried to move. So that was a real chore getting that car off of there. We had to unload it, of course, to get the weight off of the axle and differential. Then we had to jack it up and put material underneath the wheels so that the car was cleared of the stump. But we eventually got it and drug it down across the fields and over to the woodshed. And then those pieces were thrown into the woodshed in a large pile. And we kept accumulating this pile. A few days or every opportunity we had, we'd go out in the woods and get another load of wood. And between times, it was my job to chop these pieces of wood into finer strips of kindling so that Mom could easily get them started in the morning. So the way I did that, we had a piece of stump in the entrance of the woodshed I used as a chopping block, and I'd stand the end of the piece on the top of the block vertically. Then with the axe handle between my legs and my left hand holding the stick, I swung the axe with my right hand and split the wood. You know, when I think about that, my axe was not missing my hand by a great deal, and it's fortunate that I didn't lose a finger or two during all that process, because I did that for many summers, and I cut thousands of pieces of pine. I'd say the pieces that I tried to get were no larger than 2 inches square, and the pine was the best because it had pitch in it that easily ignited. So by the end of the summer, before winter came, I had a large pile of splintered and cut up the firewood ready for Mom's use during the winter. And of course, when it came time to carry them in the house, they had to be picked up one piece at a time in a large armload and carried up those steps to the kitchen and put in a wooden box there that we called a wood box. And of course, when all the fuel, wood and coal that is, was placed in the appropriate locations in the kitchen, they had to be used. And of course, Mom started the fires the first thing every day in the morning, early, by by working the grates and dumping the clinkers out of the bottom of the firebox there in the stove. And then she'd place newspapers and my firewood in there and light them with a big wooden match. And when the wood was ignited, then she'd start adding coal carefully, small amounts, and get the coal going. It took several hundred degrees of heat to ignite the coal, and then she'd gradually feed more and more coal until the entire fire was composed of burning coal. It gave off substantial heat, but of course in the wintertime the house was comparable to the exterior temperatures, so it took a long time to raise the temperature in the rooms in the kitchen. Primarily, the other rooms were never heated, except on rare occasions in the living room where the big old stove was fired up. And that was done, well, it wasn't done while Dad was in the CC camps. We never did that because it required too much effort to carry the fuel for that stove too. But during the years that Dad was there, in the evenings, if it was really cold, the stove would be fired up and make it a little more comfortable in the sitting room there where, well, Dad would read a newspaper, I guess, or talk, or it just made a little more warm space in the house. But of course, the upstairs were bitterly cold all the time, or scorchingly hot. But Mom had to nurse that fire for perhaps an hour before it was going well on its own. And the coal, of course, had to be put into the stove with a small shovel out of the buckets that were placed adjacent to the stove, where she could reach down into the bucket with a small scoop shovel and take the griddle off of the top of the stove and put the coal inside. She had it down pat, and she was always able to get the fire going in the minimum amount of time, but it laborious process, and I remember seeing her standing there next to the stove in her long nightgown, heavy woolen, or cotton, very thick anyway, nightgown down to her ankles, and then with a jacket or two over that. And I don't remember anything she put on her head, but it was a cold business, and it took perseverance and just persistence in doing that every morning. She had it tough, to say the least. And I don't want to impugn my father. He was working outside, or he never sat around the house. He was not lazy by any stretch of the imagination. And when I say I chopped wood, certainly he chopped probably more than I did, but since this is my story, I'm not going to give him any more credit than I can help. But Dad was a good man, and he was kind, and he was a hard worker, but he certainly was frustrated with this depression business and not being able to find meaningful work that would gain an income to take some of the pressure off of the needs of our household. But shoveling coal from the buckets into the stove, inevitably some of it would fall out of the shovel before it got into the stove. So Mom had an endless battle against dirt. And she wasn't a scrupulous, clean crackpot, but she wanted things kept as clean as possible anyway. And she had a daily battle with sweeping the floor with mud or coal that had been spilled, or other dirt that was tracked in from the barn, or whatever it was. It was always a struggle for her to keep the floors clean and, well, just be a good housewife. And we didn't cooperate as much as we should have. I don't know. I know she I don't know how many times she said, "Don't you track those muddy shoes or boots in this house," and of course we'd try to do that to make it easier for us, but if we left if mud or something came off our boots onto the floor or our shoes, we heard about it, but of course she got busy with the broom and the dustpan and would sweep it up. Of course, this combustion produced waste products, fine ashes, and other little larger incombustible chunks that were included with as they were consumed, fell down through the grates into a pan beneath the firebox. That pan filled up fairly quickly, and it had to be pulled out of the front of the stove through a long, narrow door. This pan was probably 3 inches deep, and the size of the combustion box, about, I'd say, 2 feet long and maybe a foot wide. And when it got filled, it would restrict the airflow through the grates into the fire, so it had to be kept emptied, and that had to be done. I believe she did that about twice a day, which meant she had to pull that out, and of course there was a lot of dust and ashes and so forth that came out with it and fell on the floor, so she had to put paper down to catch all that, and then carefully carry it outside, and so I think she threw that on the garden area there. But it was a source of dirt and fine dust. The ash was usually pretty fine, and there were larger chunks in it, of course, but it was dirty. And she used those ashes too, now that I remember, to make soap, as I mentioned earlier. The kitchen table was always covered with what was called oilcloth. It was I don't know, some kind of a thin coating of plastic over fabric. And I can't imagine what kind of plastic it was. In those days, plastics was a very limited. The only plastic I know of in those early days was isinglass, and I can't believe that isinglass was part of that. But It was some kind of a slick, fairly tough film on top of this cloth, and that was brightly painted, or bright patterns printed on it, either checks or flowers or something in bright colors. So I don't know how long it was lasted, maybe a year. I know they got the covering got pretty tattered after a while, and Mom would buy some more. It must have been pretty cheap because it cost money to replace it, and it wasn't done very often, but it really brightened up the kitchen. Of course, Mom had to wash and dry the dishes after supper, and in the summer, I don't know what she did after supper. I know that she'd frequently go out to the garden and play around with her vegetables or flowers. I don't have any memory of exactly what she did, especially in the winter when there wasn't anything growing outside and it was cold. I don't know what either one of them did after supper, other than as I said, the garden work in the summertime. So we usually worked till dark or close to it, cultivating or whatever. There was an endless array of chores that never seemed to get completed. Life became a lot easier for Mom after 1939, when the REA turned on the power and gave us electricity. The REA was an organization established by President Roosevelt in the 30s, in the mid-30s, to provide electricity to the rural countryside. Frenchville, a couple miles away, had had electricity for several years, but it was installed by the Pennsylvania Power and Electric Company. It was a privately owned operation, and they couldn't afford to install power lines where the return on the investment was actually a negative situation. So they only installed lines where the housing and towns were able to be connected in reasonably short distances. So the REA, Rural Electrification Association, was established by the government, by President Roosevelt, and used government funding to provide electricity to remote locations such as ours throughout the country. This work began in 1936, and by the time it got to our area, it was probably 1937 or 38. I don't remember the year. I do remember the survey that was made to locate the line and the pole locations and the guy wires that supported it. And I remember walking with Dad through the woods where they had the surveyors had driven stakes to indicate where the poles and the guy wires were supposed to be installed. Well, I didn't know I never heard of guy wire. Never heard that term before, but Guy was my father's name. And as we were walking along, I saw a stake driven in the ground with the word GUY on it. And so I was surprised to see his name on the stake, and I asked him why it was there, and then he told me that was a wire to support the pole at a turn or a change of direction. The wire that comes down at an angle from the top of the pole to anchor in the ground. So it wasn't long after that when the manpower appeared and the trees were cut and slashed through the woods and over the hills and so forth, and direct lines was made, and the holes then were for the poles were then dug. I remember the pole that was installed right at our front yard fence, and I remember talking to the guy that was digging the hole. It was Hillary Billett, the same Hillary Billett that got married and drove over our chickens, which I'll talk about a little later on. But in any case, he was digging a hole. All the holes were dug manually and with long-handled pivoting shovels. I remember he went through a coal seam there right in front of the house. We talked about it, but it had too much contaminants in it to make it commercially profitable to evacuate. the poles and the wires were soon strung, and of course, before we could enjoy the electricity, our house had to be wired. And my dad hired his nephew, son of his sister Helen, who lived in Clearfield, and his name was Paul Malloy, and he was an electrician. So he came down, I remember, and since our house was a planking construction, it made installation of the wiring and receptacles difficult. So, but he installed a little fuse box in the basement with two glass fuses, 10 amp capability. So we had two circuits in the house with 10 amps available on each one, which is a pitiful amount compared to, well, my house here has 200 amps, and it's just barely sufficient really for all my tools and everything. But just think, only two 10 amp fuses, and in those days the fuses were made out of glass and screwed in to a socket similar to the socket on a light bulb, and there's a little wire handle sticking out the side of the box where you could disconnect the circuits, to those two circuits simultaneously from the power supply. I remember visiting Paul and his family one time when I was small. We had Sunday dinner, and they had a refrigerator in the dining room. In those days, refrigerator compressors and the motors made a lot of noise. And so Paul took the guts out of the refrigerator and put it down in the basement and extended the Freon lines up to the evaporator and condenser that was in the box itself. So the thing was absolutely silent, and was pleased that he was able to do that and get the noise out of the kitchen. And nevertheless, we had a receptacle in each room, and the code then, I don't even know if there was a code, but anyway, it was sufficient for what we had then, because all we had was a refrigerator. Well, we didn't have anything, and the first thing that, after the power was turned on and we had light bulbs instead of a kerosene lamp, was to get a refrigerator. So Mom and Dad went to Clearfield, and this was 1939, and Dad was beginning to get some work, and they went to a appliance store up there and bought a 6-foot Frigidaire refrigerator. And I remember the day they delivered it, they were unloading it, and they dinged the side of the box. It made a rather sharp ding and noticeable. Certainly it didn't affect the function of the refrigerator, but Dad and Mom agreed that they didn't want it with a dent in it. So the driver, of course we didn't have a telephone or any way of communicating with the store in Clearfield, but the driver had the authority, and he took $10 off of the price of it. And so Dad got that refrigerator for $90. And that was a great help to Mom. And of course I didn't have to carry milk then down to the spring every day and go down and get it when she needed some. And then it had ice cubes in it, and which is something we never had. Even in the winter, we didn't cut ice or make anything out of ice. And then of course Mom broke out her stuff that she'd had when they were first married, and before she was married she had some stuff. So now we had an electric toaster, which eliminated the need to hold a slice of bread over the open fire in the stove. And she had an electric iron. That eliminated those sad irons, so they got forever relegated to the outshed. But most of all, too, was a washing machine. And the old Maytag was hauled out of its slumber and brought up on the back porch. And from then on, Mom had an electric washer and a wringer that she didn't have to crank by hand, and she didn't have to scrub the clothes on the corrugated board anymore. Essentially, she could keep her hands out of the water. So that really gave her eliminated a lot of hard, backbreaking work for her. Of course, she still had to hang them up on the clothesline. I bought Mom a dryer in 1961, along with an automatic washer, so that she could do it all right there in the kitchen. In 1969, a professor from the University of Pennsylvania State College came to Frenchville and spent some time and recording the conversations of old French. For example, my Uncle Charlie and other old Frenchmen around there, and wrote an article in some scientific journal that about the purity of the French pronunciation in Frenchville. It hadn't been altered or changed in any way since the time of the immigration in the early 1830s and 40s. And he remarked on how unique it is to listen to that, listen to a conversation in that ancient pronunciation. And he predicted that soon there won't be any more French spoken in Frenchville. And unfortunately, I think by about the year 2000, I became the last of the French-speaking people who learned the language from their parents at the supper table, let's say, at their home anyway, when they were children. But it's sad in a way, but that's life in a big city. In the Globe Peugeot Press, pages 62 and 64, and this was written in about 1980. It says, and I'm going to quote it verbatim here, so I'm going to read it to be sure I'm accurate. Going to Frenchville can't be an afterthought. You have to make up your mind to make the trip. No place in Pennsylvania could care less about enticing tourists. In fact, as recently as the 60s, researchers going there preferred to travel in pairs because they expected to be unwelcome to the point of shotgun fire. I don't know how they ever got that impression. That really is a stretch, because it's not true, but it was published anyway. It was rifles that were used by the natives, not shotguns. You can't believe anything you read anymore. The little village of 700 people hides in a pocket of the hills in the mountainous area of Clearfield County, near no major city or important landmark. That's true. Your drive takes you through the kind of countryside that science fiction movie producers look for to film prehistoric Earth. The trip over the pitted blacktop roads through the remains of played-out strip mines, some of them growing scraggly conifers planted as part of a reclamation project. That's true. The few outsiders who venture to Frenchville come because of the language. People in Frenchville speak classically pure French, without any American accent and without the slang of contemporary French streets. Hardly a generation ago, most of the adults could not read or write French. And even the inscriptions on tombstones are misspelled and grammatically incorrect. But the people speak French flawlessly. What seems to have happened begins nearly 150 years ago, when the villagers' ancestors walked overland from parts of Baltimore and New York to settle here. Apparently they walked because they signed a purchase agreement for what seemed like a bargain terms. 12 acres free for each 50 bought. That's a new twist that I hadn't heard before, but it's certainly possible. They didn't understand that they were making a deal for isolated land inaccessible by normal transport. In this location, people farmed, mined, worked nearby railroads as they developed and stuck together, speaking French among themselves. That's true. That's accurate. Outside the community, they spoke little English, but since nobody got into extended conversations with foreign miners and railroad workers, it didn't add up to much. As new inventions came along, the villagers simply incorporated English words into their talking. For example, automobile, radio, television. Aside from such words, the language in French will remain pure classical French. Consolidated schools educating children outside the community have been diluting the effort for the past 10 or 20 years, as has television. But you can still hear the old French from villagers named Russie, Rougie, and Ploubel. People who remember apple butter making parties and French festivals. The best way to get a taste of the phenomenon of a special village is to park your car, walk the street, wander through the graveyard inspecting headstones, stop into the few stores, the taverns, plural, and perhaps the post office, and simply respectfully listen. To get to Frenchville, go north on Route 879 from I-80 to Clearfield. After your visit, you may want to return to Clearfield, where you'll find fairly inexpensive rates at one of the several good quality standard motels. You may enjoy walking the Clearfield streets to see several historic buildings that are in full use downtown. An article in the Journal du Dimanche, the Sunday journal, established in Paris, France, described the perfection of 18th century French spoken in Frenchville. The only corruption was the use of English words, such as automobile, airplane, radio, and other modern inventions for which no French words had been invented. The Dallas Morning News of July 28, 1983 ran a similar story. The Sunday Bulletin, published in Philadelphia August 17, 1969, ran an extensive article about Frenchville and quoted Dr. Simon Velasco, Romance language professor at Pennsylvania State University, who said, "The language is surprisingly pure, considering that people came from several parts of France and have been handing it down unalterated for 5 generations. I took some of my students out to Frenchville a while back and took some recordings of the people speaking French. At least now we have a permanent record of the French spoken in Frenchville." At the time Dr. Velasco made these recordings, there were still a number of old-timers and some younger ones alive who possessed the skills to flawlessly speak this 18th century French. Today, at the beginning of the 21st century, these people are gone, and few of the remaining older residents can say more than a few words. My own experience in Frenchville and in France, when I was there a number of times, it proved to be awkward to converse anymore, and it shows how, since my dad died in 1961, I haven't spoken French more than several hours in this whole time frame. How quickly it seems that, in spite of speaking French from the time of my birth, for a little over 30 years of my life, that it has escaped fluency and ease. So I think it's time to end this video, and we'll go to the next one.